they have earned, they come to us. IRS, veterans, passports, immigration, and of course, Social Security. They rely on us to help them with that. And since I've been in office, we have worked on thousands and thousands of cases related to Social Security. And I'm proud to say that when it comes to Social Security, we have had numerous success stories for people who come to us after struggling to get answers. So we get the inquiry, we get on the horn, and we push the agencies to get them to do the right thing, to get to yes for our constituents. We highlight the issue, we push the issue, and there are people there to help us solve the issue. Now, unfortunately, this administration is doing the exact opposite. It's putting the Social Security Agency in a wood chipper by cutting the people and gutting the systems that help us, that help our constituents get their earned benefits. They want to decimate it. They want to tear it down, and eventually, it looks like that they want to privatize it. They are doing this by planning to close nearly 50 field offices and slashing the Social Security workforce by 12%. They have not provided evidence to prove that this can be done without impacting benefits. If anything, they are proving the opposite. Closing field offices means longer travel times and less help for people looking for guidance. Reducing the workforce means fewer people to review disability claims, hear appeals, answer phones, and sort through the paperwork required to claim survivor benefits. Last year, Social Security call wait times were actually improving and reduced to 13 minutes. This year, they're already back to doubling that time at over a half hour. What's worse is that as a part of these cuts by DOGE, the acting Social Security Commissioner, Leland Dudek, said himself that outsiders who are unfamiliar with the nuances of the Social Security programs are making decisions and they will make mistakes. Mr. Chairman, mistakes could have terrible consequences for our constituents, for your constituents, and for the access of benefits that they have earned. Look, our duty as members of Congress is to conduct oversight. That means asking the administration basic questions about what they are doing with taxpayer resources and why these actions have been taken. Like I said, and I think many of you, all of us, are proud of the casework we do when we make government work for people. But when those services stop or get reduced, the least that we can do is live up to our responsibility as members of Congress to find out why, how, and what. We're asking for it, but let me tell you, our constituents, your constituents, are demanding it. So it's well past time that we stop abdicating our constitutional responsibilities and start pushing back on this administration, Elon Musk, and DOGE. We fight to ensure that our constituents get those services. Let's fight by supporting this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back and now recognize Ms. Delbene for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. Larson.
I thank the gentlelady from Washington. And I would, Mr. Chairman, like to submit for the record, in fact, it just came out, that under the title of Democracy Dies in Darkness, Social Security facing pressure from DOGE weighs big cuts to phone service. You question why we want to have Elon Musk in front of us. And here, the very group that he's leading is pressuring people to do away with the phone service. As Mr. Panetta just mentioned, his constituents are responding, as are all of our constituents.
Pursuant to the unanimous consent request, that's so ordered.
Pardon?
Unanimous consent, so ordered.
Thank you for, and continuing with this article, because I think it's very relevant to the discussion here and should be part of the record. It would take me 10 minutes to read it. But it deserves to be here, along with, we've heard today a lot about facts. Here's the facts. Here's the truth. There are over 70 million Americans who rely on Social Security. 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible for Social Security. There has been no adjustment to Social Security in over 50 years. 5 million of your fellow Americans get below poverty level checks from Social Security, having paid into it all their lives. Most of them are women, and of them, most of them are women of color. For close to 50% of all Americans, Social Security is the main thing they have. The genius of Franklin Delano Roosevelt is still with us today. It is the safety net for capitalism that you guys should be joining with us to make sure that we preserve and extend and provide that opportunity where you have an environment where you can take risk, knowing that there's a safety net there for the very people who work hard and play by the rules every day to make that investment. I yield my remaining of my time to Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. So my friend, Mr. Bean, pointed out a couple of things that I think are really important. So let's take a look at the record. In 1981, President Reagan presided over a substantial tax cut. In 1982, President Reagan looked at the tax cut and said, no, 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 it's too much, we have to revisit it, which he did. In 1990, President Bush Sr., after having made a pledge at a Republican National Convention, based on what he thought were the facts at the time, came back and looked at the facts in 1990 and changed his mind. In 1993, Bill Clinton, he decided that there had to be cuts and revenue increases. In 1997, again, it took place. I would also point out that the Republican leader at the time, Bob Michael, a distinguished member of Congress and a really nice guy, by the way, he went along with it. What President Bush wanted to do, and then subsequently what came to be the balanced budgets, took place 4 times. I don't understand for the life of me how we can say that we're about to add, over the objections of this side, $4 trillion to the national debt through tax cuts and say that's going to give us a balanced budget. The logic escapes all of us. So let's take Reagan, Bush, and Clinton twice and use those models for getting to what we all would like, and that's a more balanced budget picture.
Now recognize Mr. Arrington. 5 minutes to strike the last one.
I thank the chairman. Every dime that is wasted in the Social Security Administration and administrating the benefits to our beloved seniors, and quite frankly, any government program, is a dime that doesn't go to the intended beneficiary, to people that depend on these programs. And in the case of Social Security, every dime that we're not vigilant, every dime of waste that we're not vigilant about rooting out, shortens the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund, which now has a fuse of 8 years before every senior, every retiree that depends on that safety net will take an automatic 20% cut. And that's indisputable. We all agree with that. So unless and until both sides come together to actually fix the broken Social Security system so it's there and sustainable for generations, we ought to do the first order of business, and that is reducing and eliminating wasteful spending and inefficiencies in the program. I don't think there's a senior in America that would not support that. And look, if this were about just merely having a plan, we just want to know, this is just an innocent request for a little more information and transparency, then there wouldn't be this rhetoric about they're decimating the program, they're gutting the program, they're utterly destroying the program. I don't believe you right now. I don't believe that it is this sincere attempt to just understand what the plan is, because the rhetoric isn't consistent with that. It's rhetoric that is scaring our seniors. In fact, I think it's predatory. And it is not productive to the end of having us work together. And we both know, both sides know this, because I know my friend Mr. Larson has a plan. But when the Democrats had full control from top to bottom of this town, they didn't put that plan on the floor. They didn't advance it. Now, you were willing to do it. I appreciate your leadership. I don't like your plan, but you had the courage to put it forward. We all should accept the reality, political reality, that it's going to take both sides to do it, just like with Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Let me finish my point, if I may. This is not going to help us get there. This is why this place is broken, and this is why it's nearly impossible for both sides to come together, because the baseball bat, the political baseball bat, is taken out so easily and quickly to beat the other side when they're trying to do the right thing. The president said he's not going to touch the benefits, he's going to protect it. But in every program and in every way, it's being poorly managed, and dollars are misspent and misappropriated, and there's waste, and the taxpayers and the beneficiaries are being defrauded. He's going to be vigilant. His colleagues, like Elon Musk and others who've been tasked with this, will be diligent, and so will we. That is, I think, an expectation of the American people. I just called the Social Security Administration, and this was the response I got. First of all, I couldn't get to a human being. They said it's going to take a couple of hours, and I don't know any senior that wouldn't give up on that, first fact. Secondly, for the disability benefits, it says we'll get back to you in 200 days. Fill out a bunch of forms, wait for 2 hours, we'll get back to you in 200 days. There's got to be a better way to run the railroad. And seniors have suffered, and it's not, the answer isn't always throw more money at it, throw more people at it. I know that's the response for those who believe in, in the government we trust. Well, it's not working. Seniors aren't getting a good response. People aren't showing up to work, and there's a bunch of waste and fraud that needs to be dealt with head on. So I don't believe this scare tactic is going to work. It will whip our seniors into a state of anxiety and distress, and that is so unfortunate and so sad. I'm out of time, and I yield back, and I'm sure I'll hear from my friend Mr. Larson.
Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I request to strike the last word. As lawmakers, we have a solemn duty to protect our constituents, those beneficiaries on Social Security, from external threats and also from bad actors within. That's why I am calling on my colleagues to vote in favor of this resolution. The people who elected us did so with the trust that we would safeguard their privacy, ensuring their personal data is never politicized, sold to the highest bidder, or used to jeopardize their benefits. My constituents should believe and be able to trust that government will work on their behalf, regardless of who they choose to represent them on Capitol Hill as well. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from CNN, Republicans Succeed in Persuading Musk, but Democrats Hit Dead Ends.
Without objection.
Earlier this week, President Trump and Elon Musk went about cherry-picking which Social Security field and hearing offices would stay open. In the article, Mr. Cole from Oklahoma was able to convince Doge to keep.
Meet your new main squeeze, Lecom Key Honey Sriracha. The perfect balance of sweet and heat. Made for drizzling, dipping, and devouring. Be spicy with Lecom Key Honey Sriracha.
Those with Robinhood Gold can enjoy a 3% IRA match. Tremendous.
Members of Congress shouldn't have to kiss Elon Musk's ass to get our offices for our constituents on Social Security open or to have them remain open. I am offended by the fact that members on the other side are using their access to Elon Musk and jeopardizing the well-being of everyone else. My constituents deserve the same treatment that Representative Coles are receiving. And this is not about politics. It's not about voting Republican or Democrat or whether you belong to a party or not. And I also want to lift up this article that just came out because it speaks to the hypocrisy. While we are having this hearing today, and while the other side is objecting to even getting basic information about what Elon Musk is doing to Social Security, they literally announced ending the phone program that helps with claims processing and is used by millions of elderly and disabled Americans.
Without objection.
This data shows that the agency received 81.2 million calls to its national toll-free number in 2023, although not all were for claims. Staff within Social Security are currently gaming out scenarios for how to handle an abrupt reduction of telephone service, one of the persons briefed on the matter said. So to my colleagues, do you think this is cutting Social Security? It is. Do you think this is hurting constituents' ability to get their rightful questions asked about their earned benefit? This is not an entitlement. Do you think this is helping make government more efficient? And why wouldn't we have the person, the mastermind, the genius, Elon Musk, who's come up with this proposal to come before this committee? Or at least respond based on the list of questions that are called for in this query. I have 140,000 individuals in my district who depend on Social Security. The majority of them, it's their sole source of income. 108,000 are retirees. 16,500 are disabled workers who count on these benefits. And yeah, I'll bang on the damn dais because I'm here to defend my constituents from Elon Musk, Donald Trump, or House Republicans who will try to take away what they have invested into their own Social Security. This is money they earned. Take your hands off of the people's Social Security. It's not yours. And Elon Musk wasn't elected to do a damn thing. I yield back.
Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This conversation today would be much different if we were $36 trillion in surplus, but we're not. We're $36 trillion in debt. And to think that we can't have a conversation about looking at our debt and deficit and economic policy different is political malpractice. It's government malpractice. Not to have a conversation about DOGE, not to have a conversation about cutting spending, not by having a conversation about the fiscal health of our country. And it's interesting, I also serve on our House Intelligence Committee. And last year we had General Petraeus and General McChrystal, served under Republicans and Democrats, have unbelievable reputations for serving in our military. And they came and talked to us about the threats facing America from our adversaries. So they talked about China, and they talked about Russia, they talked about Iran, but they said the biggest threat is our debt and our deficit. And as most of us should know, we're paying more now on our interest than we do the entire Department of Defense. Think about that for a sec. It's insane. But yet we can't have a conversation with a new president that ran on fixing the fiscal health of this country, created the DOGE committee, Department on Government Efficiency. Again,
It's political malpractice that we're not thinking about this. I want to reference an article from it was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, dated February 25th of this year, titled "America's Future Depends on Doge." And I want to read one section of that. The message from today's civic elites is that the president's job is to pretend to be in charge while doing nothing meaningful. Shut up. Don't disturb the administrative state. Let it keep doing its thing without oversight or disruption. And you'll get your library or best-selling presidential memoir. Mr. Trump refuses this deal. In his second term, he's determined to slay the bureaucratic beast. He knows all too well from his first term and the Biden years. Doge's efforts are epic, breaking more than a century of acquiescence to spending and government. The Trump team is courageously confronting the problem head on. We have an obligation and responsibility to bring down our debt and get this country back on track economically. And the Doge Commission and what President Trump and his team are doing is putting us on that path. I yield back.
Ms. Plaskett.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Ladies recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, my colleagues today we've all been talking about accountability. And I think that this resolution speaks to accountability. Because many of us believe that the Trump administration is taking a wrecking ball to Social Security Administration. And they don't want to meet with us about that. Far from making the agency more efficient, the Trump administration is undermining its ability to serve the public. And the primary question is, why? Why is this happening? Why is privatization the goal? Why are they trying to destroy Social Security? Many of us believe it's the first step of a long-standing effort by Republicans to dismantle trust in Social Security, slash benefits, and then allow people who are disgruntled and have lost faith in it to allow Wall Street to take it over. The Trump administration wants to close Social Security offices, slash agencies' workforce. The Social Security Administration is already at a 50-year staffing low due to years of underfunding. And with baby boomers increasing the number of beneficiaries, that's a recipe for disaster. How will gutting the workforce help Social Security Administration serve the American people? The point is, it does not. That's the goal. It does not. The chaos and the confusion, the constant stream of misinformation and missteps have a purpose. Let's talk about that. The misinformation, a Ponzi scheme. Listen, I'm a New Yorker. I understand a Ponzi scheme. A con man promises a payout that he can't deliver, collects the money, and disappears. That's not what's happening in the Social Security Administration, because people have put their money in it, and they are receiving a benefit. That's not a Ponzi scheme. Repeatedly stating that dead people and 150-year-olds are receiving checks, every newspaper, every group has said that that's untrue, including the Washington Post, which has already kissed the ring of the president. They're the ones also who have said that that's not true. How are we doing this? And why are we doing this? We want to bring back accountability. My colleague has stated that Doge only has read-only access. We've seen weeks ago that that's not true. Oh, they just accidentally were able to make changes to it, they told us later on, and now they've gone back to read-only access. As a lawyer, the notion that they can be prosecuted for improper disclosure, that's if you find that they've had improper disclosure, first of all, and second of all, if they keep the information for themselves for data mining, for future elections, we would never be able to find that out to be able to prosecute it, because it's not disclosed to anyone but themselves. Why are they keeping this information, and what is the purpose of it? Make no mistake, the Trump administration's actions are to devastate the Social Security Administration's ability to serve the public and deliver Social Security payments so that they can then have access to $2.7 trillion for Wall Street to be able to play with. They need more money because you know what? We're not addicted to spending, as my colleague said. Many people are addicted to greed. That's what this is about. And the greed happens to be not from themselves, but for the American people. That's the Ponzi scheme, is them taking your damn money and using it for them own self, to enrich themselves more than they already have. That's the addiction. And you know what? This place is broken because Congress has abdicated its responsibility to be the ones to find that race fraud and abuse and to do something different about it. We're letting somebody who's unelected, who's an auditor, now he's an auditor. Is he everything? Is he God? To be able to do what he wants to do with the American people. It's got to stop. I yield back.
Any further members wish to strike the last word? Mr. Swazi.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out some basic facts that people need to understand. Jody, this is important. In the 1970s, we had about 203 million people in America. Today, we have 350 million people in America. In the 1970s, we had about 3 million federal employees. In the 1980s, we had 3.3 million federal employees. In the 1990s, we had 3.4 million federal employees. In 2020, we had 3 million, same as it was in 1970. And so we have about the same number of employees in the federal government today as we had back in the 1970s, even though the population has increased from about 203 million to 350 million people. And we've hired a lot more outside contractors than ever before. We've spent a lot more on outside contracts, like with Elon Musk, for example. But we have the same number of employees that we had back in 1970 as we do today. Now, I don't have back to 1970, but in the Social Security Department, you talked about how your phone call took a long time today. Well, who's in charge right now? Because on the day the Biden administration left, they had gotten it down to a record low response time of 12 minutes to respond to a call, which even 12 minutes to me seems like too much, but that was a record low for what it was. Today, it's going through the roof. And if you look at the number of employees in the Social Security Department, in 1999, there were 59,000 employees. In 2010, there were 66,000 employees. So 59,000 in 1999, 66,000 in 2010. At the end of the Biden administration, there were 56,000 employees, less than it was in 1999, 3,000 less than it was in 1999, and now we're talking about taking it down by another 10,000. Well, no wonder everybody's going to complain that things are broken and it's not working well, because we're trying to take it down. Now, when I was the county executive of Nassau County, we was rated the worst-run county in America before I got there, I want to point out. But we went from 8,500 employees down to about 7,000 employees. We did not do it by laying off the lowest wage new employees, the probationary employees. We did it by normal attrition and by offering retirement incentives to the highest wage, most senior employees. And when those people left, we tried to make up for the reduced workforce by improving the technology and by doing consolidation and procedures and processes to make things more efficient. What we're doing now through DOGE is so haphazard and so reckless. And the idea of trying to instill this fear in people and lay off the low-wage people, the provisionary employees, in places that we're trying to hire people up to try and get to the backlogs, like in the IRS, where we make more money than we spend when we hire employees, doesn't make any sense to me. It's just bad management, and it's just scaring the hell out of everybody in the process. And there's going to be a price to pay politically for people, because most of the federal employees live in Republican districts and in Democratic districts, but we'll see that as time goes on. All the stuff we're going to see. You say we're not going to cut Social Security, we're not going to cut Medicaid, we're not going to cut Medicare. Well, we're going to find out in the next 6 months or so what people are really up to. Then we'll really know what it is. And it's not about instilling fear or not instilling fear. We're going to find out what it is as time goes on. Right now, we're concerned that what DOGE is doing is reckless, and irresponsible. Do we need to get rid of waste, fraud, abuse? Yes. Do we need to make things more efficient? Yes. Do we need better technology? Yes. Do we need better procedures and processes? Yes. But the way that they're doing it right now, and I've given the examples before, laying off the people in the nuclear stockpile, laying off the people that oversee avian flu, laying off the people that oversee measles, doesn't make any sense to me. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to yield my remaining minute to Chairman Neal.
My friend from Illinois, he said we don't have conversations, and we have a conversation. We just disagree with you on arithmetic. The arithmetic's pretty simple. Bush Jr., $2.3 trillion worth of tax cuts. 2017, borrowing $2.3 trillion for a tax cut. Now, to hold forth on the basis of what is alleged to be this out-of-control debt. Oh, and by the way, we're going to raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion in coming weeks so that we can pay for another tax cut. I mean, the logic escapes all of us here. How we can hold forth and suggest on one hand, we're all very concerned about the debt. Oh, but we'll borrow $2.3 trillion to add more to the debt. And now, $4 trillion we will add to the debt. But we can't have that conversation because it gets in the way of our determination to continue to do borrowing and then complain about the size of the debt. I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Additional members wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, are there any amendments?
I'd like to strike the last word, and I'd
Okay.
like.
Okay, we'll do that. We moved on, but we'll do that, Ms. Miller, because you don't talk nearly as much as a lot of people on this committee. So, go, Ms. Miller.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr.
He may change his
Chairman,
mind.
but I am yielding my time to Mr. Arrington.
My name.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
You know, I would only speak because my name was invoked. My name was invoked, and my honor was questioned, my integrity, my character. Tom Suozzi would never question my integrity or character. He's too good of a friend, and I wouldn't question his. I have questioned the motive here as more political than principled, and I don't like to do that. But that's my judgment right now. I think it's too wrapped up in scoring political points, and we're whipping people up into a frenzy instead of working productively to solve some problems here. But I'm not, Tom, I'd have to look at those numbers. I have not looked at the numbers. But to suggest that the federal government had the same amount of employees in the 60s and 70s as we do in the 21st century, when we didn't even have the microwave oven, let alone the internet, is not that impressive of a stat, to be frank. I think we can probably run this government more efficiently post-technology revolution. We still need people, but we need them to show up. Like, I would have an easier time receiving some of this, really, with the sincere motive of needing more information, wanting more insight, if the same passion and concern were directed to the many government employees who were not showing up for years. And this was post-pandemic, and we just accepted it as the new normal. And when we talk about, like some of my colleagues, the Democrat colleagues, about my constituents are worth it, this is their benefit, their earned benefit, I agree. But why weren't we fighting to make sure that people were seats, butts were in seats, calls were being answered, cases were being resolved? The very fact, in every congressional office experiences, we had casework through the roof for our retirees who couldn't get their phone calls returned and couldn't get their cases resolved.
Will the gentleman yield?
But where was the indignation? Where was the fight for these constituents at that time?
Will the gentleman yield?
It's a sad thing in this country that we need retirees, our beloved seniors, to have to work through their member of Congress just to get a daggum phone call returned. So I would accept some of this is in a more sincere fashion if it was consistently applied when we had Democrat control and we had other big inefficiency problems. I trust the president. I trust people who have a track record of successfully and efficiently and effectively running organizations. I think this is long overdue. I think it should go across the government. I think we should get information and we should get insight and we should get the opportunity to change some of the things that are needed and codified by an act of Congress. Like, for example, in Medicaid, and I'll yield with the example of Medicaid, President Biden went back, revoked a policy that reviewed the Medicaid rolls twice a year so that we could ensure that only those legally eligible for Medicaid were receiving the benefit. That's a taxpayer safeguard. That's a safeguard for sustaining the program. And it was revoked from twice a year, and it was only done once a year. Well, that's $160 billion worth of waste and fraud because of a simple program integrity measure that was revoked. That's common sense. I don't think there's an American out there that would say, why in the world would we do that? So I appreciate some of the concern, but I think it is more political than principle, and I appreciate my colleagues, and I appreciate his friendship.
Chairman.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Any additional members wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments? Seeing no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report HRES 195 adversely to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to report HRES 195 adversely to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach.
Yes.
Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Yes. Mr. Moore, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Yakum. Mr. Yakum, yes. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, yes. Mr. Bean. Yes. Mr. Bean, yes. Mr. Moran. Yes. Mr. Moran, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Doggett.
We only use the best ingredients that we can get our hands on. It's always going to be the top notch. All of our cheese is graded and tested before it leaves the building.
We all aim for perfection. There's people on the floor that check through every step of the process.
We still cheddar the old-fashioned way, so that means bending over hours at a time. Very little is automated.
It really is gratifying to see a successful product come out.
As a mom, it's very important for me. You want the best for your families.
No. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans, no. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford, no. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett, no. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi, no. Mr. Kelly?
How is Mr. Gomez? I hear him recorded.
Mr. Gomez is not recorded. Mr. Gomez, no. Ms. Maliotakis? Ms. Sewell? Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The yeses are 24, the noes are 18.
There being 24 yeses and 18 noes, the motion is agreed to, and HRES 195 is ordered reported adversely to the House. Without objection, members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. We are adjourned.
Government shuts down. Of course, I don't like continuing resolutions any more than the next person, but they're certainly not the ideal way to govern, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it remains the second worst choice, a shutdown being the worst of all. So let's take a look at how we got here in the first place. Last year, the Senate Appropriations Bill, on a bipartisan basis, passed all but one of their 12 appropriations bills. And what did the majority leader, Senator Schumer, at the time, what did he do? He simply refused to schedule any of those appropriation bills for a vote. So it is because of Democratic dysfunction that we find ourselves now in a continuing resolution situation rather than having already attended to what in effect was last year's business and passing appropriations bills for the entire fiscal year. Well, if our Democratic colleagues don't like voting for another CR, I would encourage them to take that up with their now minority leader, as this falls squarely on his shoulders. But the truth is, most of all, our Democratic colleagues are just mad about the outcome of November 5th, the November 5th election. Here in the Senate, I'm glad that the Senate Republicans are working to pass this necessary CR that will ensure that we prevent a government shutdown. Mr. President, on another matter, I spoke last week about the importance of establishing a lasting peace in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia, without any chance of contradiction, is the aggressor. But I appreciate President Trump on his efforts as a peacemaker. And I congratulate the administration, particularly Secretary Rubio and the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, at working to negotiate a 30-day ceasefire. At least that's what Ukraine has agreed to. But now the ball is in Vladimir Putin's court. As I said last week, this is a big deal. Hundreds of thousands of casualties on each side have arisen as a result of this 3-year war in Ukraine. But it's important that these negotiations get it right. It's true that a lasting peace would be no small achievement. But one of the most important aspects to getting this right is to make sure that it does not result in nuclear proliferation. That is, more countries than currently have nuclear weapons getting those nuclear weapons because they feel insecure and they feel it's critical to their ability to continue to exist. As I mentioned last week, the United States, along with Russia and the United Kingdom back in 1994, signed something called the Budapest Memorandum. In this agreement, these 3 countries gave Ukraine security guarantees, guaranteeing its independence and territorial integrity in exchange for Ukraine turning over its nuclear weapons arsenal. Ukraine, of course, had been part of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union fell, it had the world's 3rd largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. And so this was a landmark agreement where Ukraine agreed, now an independent republic, agreed to turn over its nuclear weapons rather than to retain them. Such agreements are important because in the absence of non-proliferation agreements, other countries may be tempted to seek and acquire nuclear weapons to provide for their own security and their own protection. This is another reason why it's so important to achieve a lasting peace in the ongoing war by Russia against Ukraine, now going on 3 years. Nuclear proliferation is different. It is a unique threat, and it is a threat to America's core interests and to peace in the world. It's much harder to create a safer, more peaceful world if the number of countries seeking nuclear weapons is growing. I know President Trump concurs, and he's described nuclear weapons as an existential threat, which they are. I know that sounds dire, and perhaps we'd like not to think about such terrible things, but we must, because it is reality. In the wake of weak or non-existent security assurances in a more dangerous world, thanks to Russia, China, and Iran, additional countries are starting to think about acquiring nuclear programs. This is happening in Poland, where Prime Minister Donald Tusk suggested that Poland might, quote, reach for opportunities related to nuclear weapons, close quote. Poland, of course, is a signatory to the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which prohibited all but 5 declared nuclear powers at the time from acquiring nuclear weapons. In a similar vein, Germany, through the newly elected chancellor, has discussed the possibility that France and Britain might share their nuclear arsenal with Ukraine. Now, these are warning signs. These are flashing red signs that no one should take lightly. While we, of course, welcome European countries, primarily members of NATO, to increase their defense spending for conventional purposes, nuclear proliferation is not the way to a more stable and peaceful world. If we look back to 1956, the United States had to step in to prevent the Suez Crisis from escalating into a nuclear conflict between the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. In 1973, a nuclear alert during the Arab-Israeli War. United States nuclear forces were put on alert in response to what turned out to be, thankfully, a false alert. But again, in 1999, the United States stepped in to stop nuclear escalation during the Kargil war between India and Pakistan. So it is imperative that while the United States facilitates a lasting and enforceable peace between Russia and Ukraine, that at the same time we need to reduce the likelihood of nuclear proliferation. Suffice it to say, the stakes could not be higher. We're living in one of the most dangerous times since World War II. President Trump and Vice President Vance are correct in taking all reasonable and necessary efforts to end the war in Ukraine, but it requires a stable and lasting and enforceable peace to prevent this proliferation of nuclear weapons. I applaud President Trump for his efforts to bring about this peace. If President Trump can successfully pull this off, it will be an accomplishment for which humanity will owe him a profound debt of gratitude. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President?
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you. On roll call vote number 1141, on roll call vote number 114, I was recorded as a yes. It was my intention to vote no. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to change my vote since it will not affect the outcome.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Senator from New York.
Mr. President, I want to tell you about an extraordinary woman, my senior advisor, Jerry Shapiro. Jerry is in the final stages of a long battle with cancer, and so I wanted to express my deepest gratitude and thanks for her service to my office and to all of New York State. Jerry joined my staff in 2009 after having served as Hillary Clinton's Westchester Regional Director. But she's so much more than just a member of my staff. She's one of my closest confidants, mentors, and friends. She is truly one of a kind. Jerry is an institution in Westchester County, New York. She knows everybody and everyone knows her name. Everyone knows her as when Jerry gives her word, it's as good as gold. She's an expert in so many important areas of policymaking, and the depth of knowledge she brings to any conversation is as impressive as her ability to make people feel at ease. My staff, most of whom are decades younger, adore her energy and her spirit. Jerry's also one of the kindest people you're ever going to meet. She cares deeply about all of her fellow New Yorkers. But don't let that fool you. She's also tough as nails. Jerry tells it like it is and doesn't pull punches. She's fearless and formidable, and her family calls her the expediter because she gets things done. With Jerry on your side, you know you can't lose. A longtime resident who grew up in New Rochelle, Jerry's first career as a homemaker and a mom, she devoted much of her time to caring also for her aging parents. During that time, she took courses at Columbia University and became a stockbroker to support her ailing father's business. She also volunteered at her daughter Leslie's school, where she served as Edgemont PTA president. In 2000, Jerry was inspired to volunteer for Hillary Clinton's Senate campaign because she admired Hillary's passion for health care. Hillary immediately recognized Jerry's talent and hired her as her Westchester Regional Director when Jerry was already 59 years old. In Jerry's own words, it gave her a whole new meaning to the term late bloomer, and she credits Hillary's young staffers for helping her learn the ropes. To this day, Jerry is among the oldest members of staff in Congress. She is proof positive that you can do amazing things at any age. I first met Jerry when I also volunteered on Hillary Clinton's Senate race. When I became senator, I asked her to continue to serve as my Westchester County expert. I remember meeting her at the train stop in Westchester early in my Senate tenure and knowing then and there that I would have a friend for life. Since then, Jerry has led our community outreach in Westchester and has become a deeply valued member of our team. She's my go-to expert when it comes to anything related to Indian Point Nuclear Facility. She knows the ins and outs of policymaking and procedure better than most, and she's become an invaluable source for people working on nuclear energy regulation, especially with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and its Indian Point decommissioning process. But if it's not nuclear policy, it's something just as important, like her leadership on my aging working group, or her work with health care and disability advocates. Jerry understands the substance of the work, and she knows how to channel her experiences into bigger causes. But what really sets her apart is that she understands how much relationships matter. Whether you're a neighbor, a CEO, a friend, a high-ranking elected official, Jerry is the first person you turn to. Her instincts are spot on. She connects with people in ways that few others can, and she always brings a human touch to everything she does. She mentors my staff on the importance of public service and the power of grassroots organizing. She emphasizes what it means to connect with a community and to understand the needs of our constituents. And she gives everything her full attention and effort and leads by example in everything she does. She clearly sees her work not just as her job, but as her personal calling. Throughout my Senate career, Jerry has not only been an outstanding strategic and political advisor, but also a dear, dear friend. She gives me heartfelt advice when I need it most and shows thoughtfulness and generosity to everyone who knows her. She's hardworking, she's caring, and the most dedicated Senate staffer that I know by her years served and service given. When Jerry speaks, people listen. And when she gives advice, you know it comes from a place of deep knowledge and careful thought. New York and this nation need more leaders like Jerry Shapiro. When asked what motivates her, Jerry says, "Do good, feel good," a maxim that is evident in everything she's ever done. She's truly an inspiration to everyone who knows her, and I'm so grateful for everything she's done for Westchester, for our great state, and for our country. Thank you, Jerry. We love you, and we will always remember how you made us feel.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come here to speak briefly about the status of the peace talks led by the United States and President Trump involving both Ukraine and Putin. First, I want to thank President Trump there's one thing that President Trump has been consistent with. He hates war, and he tries to do everything he can to bring peace. We attempt it. He's attempted that across the globe. He's working right now on trying to settle the situation in the Middle East, and then we're trying to address the situation in Ukraine. Now, the response from Ukraine after President Zelensky, let's keep in mind that President Zelensky, over the past week, has withstood attacks in Ukraine that has killed more people that are sitting up in the gallery right now. So that's over the past couple of days. Killed roughly twice as many people that are in the gallery right now, many of them civilians. I'm not even counting any of the losses on the battlefield. Now, Vladimir Putin says he needs a little bit of time to assess his what part of a complete ceasefire is difficult to understand? Right? Stop killing people. Ukraine said that they would. They're ready to sign a 30-day ceasefire now. Why do you think Putin's not ready to sign it right now? They've got to examine what a complete ceasefire means. It's because this liar and this murderer is trying to find ways to get an angle before they agree to any peace agreement. He would probably like a partial one, because then he could lie about his orders to kill people and destroy Ukraine's infrastructure under the auspices of a limited ceasefire. If Vladimir Putin comes back with a proposed limited ceasefire, then you know he's looking to kill and destabilize Ukraine, Moldova, the West Balkans. It'll be interesting to see how he weighs in the vote today in Srpska, where their parliament is voting to separate from BiH, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and create a Russian separatist state in BiH. So my guess is he doesn't want to sign up to a ceasefire because he hasn't moved all the pieces around to make sure that he can still murder as many Ukrainians as possible during the supposed limited ceasefire. So I would say to the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky, thank you. In spite of the fact that dozens of people have died this week, including civilians, at the hands of decisions made by Putin, thank you for being willing to lay down your guns and try and get to peace there. But the American people need to know that Putin is a liar. He is a murderer. He hates democracy. He is not trying. The reason that he is in Ukraine now is because Ukraine is finally, after about 20 years of wasted time, that is in part because they had Russians and thugs preventing Ukraine from moving forward on the democratic reforms they know they need to do. Well, over the past 7 or 8 years, they started taking that seriously, and they're starting to make democratic reforms. They're starting to talk about maybe accession into the EU. And that scares the hell out of Vladimir Putin, because the last thing he wants is a successful former satellite of the Soviet Union demonstrating that democracy works and communism never has. That's what he's worried about. That's the provocative act that he used as a predicate to invade Ukraine and kill tens of thousands of people, including hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers. He is afraid of democracy proving to work in a society that was under the yoke of communism for decades. That's what this is about, folks. This is about good versus evil. This is about totalitarian versus this messy thing we call democracy. So, Mr. President, if Vladimir Putin can't understand what an unconditional ceasefire means, it's because he doesn't want to. It's because he still wants to find a way to murder and undermine democratic reforms and the people of Ukraine being finally free. So, Mr. President, I do want to thank President Trump for taking the initiative, for showing Ukrainians a path. But I also want to make sure that this administration and everybody in America know that Putin will not rest until his vision of communist fiat throughout this world is realized. We have to help Ukraine be free. We have to make Putin lose in Ukraine. We have to recognize that North Korea, China, Iran are just chafing at the bit to see Putin succeed there, so they can export their brand of terrorism and communism throughout the world. There is nothing redeemable in Vladimir Putin. He is an evil man responsible for the murders of hundreds of thousands of people, nearly 1 million in the last 3 years in Ukraine alone. We all need to go in open-eyed and understand that this is the true nature of Vladimir Putin, and he cannot succeed in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
President,
Senator from Iowa.
2 points, a short one and a long one. The short one is simply this, to remind my colleagues that at the beginning of the year, we get a Senate calendar that says what days we're going to be in session and what days we aren't going to be in session. Between now and the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, we have 16 Fridays that we're supposed to be in session. Will we be in session on those Fridays? We've had a few Friday sessions this year so far, but I'm afraid if we don't count on being a little more devoted to a 5-day work week, those Fridays will slip away from us. I bring that to our attention because we always are complaining because we don't have enough time to do appropriation bills. These extra 16 days that we might not be in session would be a good amount of time to take care of the 12 appropriation bills that we have to do regularly. Now, I always say there's enough work for a senator, an individual senator, to do 7 days a week if he wants to work it. But you can't solve this country's problems if you're only in session 2.5 or 3 days a week. And that's what was the practice of the United States Senate before the Republicans took over. And Republicans are supposed to make a difference, and I think a big difference we can make in the United States Senate is showing that we're running in a business-like way the United States Senate, and that is to get more work done and particularly to do our separate appropriation bills instead of doing one great big 1,000-page appropriation bill just before government's ready to shut down. The second point, and a little longer, is to discuss for my colleagues the disastrous legacy of the Biden-Harris administration's Environmental Protection Agency. Sadly, the recent revelations of wasteful spending by the EPA under the last administration are no surprise. And if you're a Democrat and you get tired of Republicans complaining about something being wrong in the previous administration, hear me out, and I think you'll agree that a lot of things happened at the end of the last administration that are just a violent misuse of taxpayers' money. 2 years ago, I wrote to the Biden EPA about a program called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I asked a very simple question: how the EPA planned to administer and oversee the taxpayers' money that was going to be spent by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I also expressed doubts about the EPA's handling such a large program, given the agency's lack of oversight of how they expend the taxpayers' money. And as you would expect, I requested its plans to ensure this money would be spent responsibly. Now, these are pretty simple questions that Congress and the taxpayers ought to be given an answer to. In its response to my letters, the Biden EPA gave me lip service about its commitment to the oversight of the spending of the money in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The Biden EPA said it would require, quote, rigorous, transparent risk management and accountability measures, end of quote. Now, if they had actually done that, that's a responsible way of handling the taxpayers' money. But the Biden EPA failed to describe how it would accomplish all of that rigorous transparency and also answer the questions that I asked them to answer. And clearly, then, based upon the Trump administration's recent revelation of fraud, waste, and abuse, EPA's response to me was really, in the end, nothing but lip service. For example, in December of last year, the Biden-Harris administration, near its end, Brent Elfrun, EPA's special advisor for implementation, was actually filmed saying the agency had rushed taxpayer money out the door. That EPA official called the effort an insurance policy against the incoming administration, Trump administration, to make sure that the money was out the door so the Trump administration couldn't stop it. The EPA official also stated, now this is Brent Elfrun, quote, "It's like we're on the Titanic and we're throwing gold bars over the edge," end of quote. The EPA official said his job was, quote, "just how to get the money out as fast as possible before they came in and stopped it all," end of quote. The they he was talking about is the new Trump administration. Now, this conduct is an example of the contempt and the lack of respect that the previous administration had for the American taxpayers' dollars. In January of this year, I met with Lee Zeldin in my office before his confirmation as President Trump's EPA administrator. I was encouraged by his shared commitment to transparency and accountability. After Mr. Zeldin took office, I wrote to him asking that he find the gold bars, so to speak, and take steps to get this taxpayers' money back that was shoveled out the door in the last few days of the previous administration. Since that letter, Administrator Zeldin found that in the months leading up to President Trump's taking office, the Biden-Harris EPA sheltered $20 billion of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund out of the Treasury at Citibank. Now that's a lot of gold bars. Administrator Zeldin explained this unprecedented move by the Biden EPA was done to protect the program from government oversight. This revelation shows the Biden EPA not only obstructed my investigations, but the oversight assurances it tried to offer me were dishonest. Administrator Zeldin also referred this mismanagement to the EPA Acting Inspector General and noted that there's an ongoing FBI investigation. I'm encouraged by what Administrator Zeldin has done so far, and I expect him to provide records responsive to my inquiries showing the Biden EPA fraud, waste, and abuse. Now, a closer look into the recipients of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund exposed several ethical red flags. Jahi Wise, President Biden picked to lead the program, oversaw a $5 billion grant to his former employer. That employer is the Coalition for Green Capital. And on August 8, 2024, quote, build the National Green Bank and a network with self-sustaining community leaders in every state, end of quote. Another $2 billion taxpayer dollars went to an organization called Power Forward Communities, and on August the 8th, to reportedly offer financing for residential carbon emission reduction projects, end of quote. Power Forward Communities is made of 5 non-government organizations, including Rewiring America. The leadership of this group is full of familiar faces from past Democratic administrations, and I'll give you 4 examples. Sean Donovan, listed on Power Forward's tax documents as the director and co-chair, was President Obama's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Ari Matuzashek, also listed as a director and co-chair, served as special assistant to President Obama and director of private sector engagement in the Obama White House. The vice president of Rewiring America is Cammie Croft, deputy director in the Obama White House and senior advisor in the Obama Department of Energy. And then a name that's pretty famous to anybody in politics and really famous in Georgia is Stacey Abrams, the failed gubernatorial nominee that President Obama campaigned for, is reportedly senior counsel for Rewiring America. The FBI and the EPA Office of Inspector General must fully investigate this situation and determine where the money was used to line the pockets of well-connected Democrats. As my oversight has shown, the legacy of Biden-Harris administration EPA will be one of unprecedented spending with no accountability and transparency. This blatant lack of discipline and lack of respect for the taxpayers' monies enabled EPA's left-wing allies to profit at the expense of the American taxpayer. All the while the Biden EPA obstructed my efforts to conduct independent and objective oversight. President Trump and Administrator Zeldin must return the EPA to its mission of protecting the health of our environment while spending taxpayers' dollars with transparency and accountability. My message to the new Director of EPA, Administrator Zeldin, is this: keep exposing waste, fraud, and abuse, and provide all the records. I yield the floor, and you yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about something that I have spoken about on this floor before. Last September, an incredible young woman named Lulu Grimmin really came onto the scene with regards to a piece of legislation that we put forth before this body. You see, her life changed forever in July of last year. She's an incredible young woman from Mountain Brook, Alabama. She brought her entire community, her state, and now our nation together. That's because on June 7th of last year, out of the blue, she was attacked by a shark. And her and a friend were looking for sand dollars, and obviously all of this came unexpectedly. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. The doctors, nurses, EMTs, and everyday people on the beach that day saved Lulu's life. But the real miracle was just beginning. When Lulu woke up from surgery that day and got taken off of her ventilator, her very first words were, "I made it." That has become a mantra, not just in how she reemerged, but in the way that she has pushed forward. After a long rehabilitation, she came back to Alabama 3 months after the accident. She was determined. When you talk with her parents, they tell you about her aggressiveness when other amputees would come and visit her, and they would tell her how long it took them to walk or to do other things. She would say, "I'm going to do it faster. I'm going to do it better." She was back outclassing golfers there at a driving range not too long after. She refused letting losing an arm or a leg stop her. Just last week, Lulu spoke publicly for the very first time since the shark attack. Her grace, her faith, her strength, her perseverance, it was an inspiration to all of us. Lulu told a crowd that morning that she wakes up ready to conquer the day, every day, and that she is motivated to keep getting better. She launched a foundation called Lulu Strong to help others in need get the prosthetic technologies that will make their lives easier. After visiting Walter Reed just a few weeks ago, you can tell how this advocacy could actually change lives. When the unimaginable changed her world, what Lulu decided to do was change our world for the better. Lulu is a modern-day American hero. The courage she's shown, the fight, the resolve that she's demonstrated are truly remarkable, and not just for a 16-year-old, but for anyone. But it shouldn't have to be this way. Lulu is indeed an inspiration, but this tremendous battle that she's fought and won could have been prevented in the first place. You see, when I heard Lulu's story, I learned that there was another shark attack that happened just right down the shore 90 minutes earlier. Elizabeth Foley, a mother of 3 from Virginia, tragically lost her hand to a shark bite and suffered other terrible injuries, resulting in 26 surgeries. After talking with Lulu and her family, we said it doesn't have to be this way. They knew there was something that could have been done. And after talking, we knew that there had to be a better way to get information out there to warn beachgoers about shark attacks in the area. That's when we introduced Lulu's Law. And it's why I'm reintroducing this bill in this Congress today. This bill, which I am proud to share, has bipartisan support. It would empower local authorities to issue wireless emergency alert warning beachgoers of potential shark attacks through the already existing wireless emergency alert system. This has the potential to make a real difference in Americans' lives. And when we're giving the opportunity to do something simple that can make such a big difference, I believe we have to take it. To Lulu, I want you to know how much you inspire all of us. Your bravery in the face of the unimaginable, it's just amazing. And you taking what happened to you and saying, how can I make others' lives better? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen to someone else? We want to honor the strength that you've shown over the past 9 months. To Lulu's parents, Ann Blair and Joe Gribben, the way you've all rallied our state and our country to support Lulu on her road to recovery is truly unbelievable. To my colleagues in the Senate, on both sides of the aisle, whether you represent a state on the coast or you represent citizens on the interior, there is no doubt we want to keep our citizens safe, whether they live there or they're visiting. Making sure that we put safeguards in place that can prevent another tragedy from occurring is imperative. Let's pass this law. Let's celebrate this amazing young woman, and let's prevent this from happening again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from New York.
I'd like to take a moment to honor the late Dr. Hazel Dukes, who died earlier this month. Hazel was not just my mentor and longtime friend. She was an extraordinary advocate for members of the African American community across New York State. When I was first appointed to the Senate, Hazel took me under her wing. She helped me learn how to do my job well and how to serve my constituents effectively. Hazel was a wise and generous soul. She was a trailblazer in the civil rights movement and the longstanding president of New York's NAACP. She fought housing discrimination on Long Island and was a tireless advocate for equal education opportunities. Hazel's leadership shaped the NAACP, and she inspired future generations nationwide. Hazel was truly a treasure, and I was devastated to learn of her passing. Her legacy will live on in the fight for justice she waged and the lives that she changed. May we honor her by continuing the work she so fiercely championed. Hazel, we will miss you very much, and we will always remember you. May God bless you and keep you. That's the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also-Brooks.
think so. I gotta do a UC too. To vitiate. How do we to vitiate? No.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that privileges of the floor be granted to the following members of my staff: Sammy Collins Head and Julia Washer.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I returned Sunday night from 2 days in Ukraine. It was my third trip since the war began, and it came at a perilous and difficult time. A week earlier, President Trump had blown up a meeting with President Zelensky, starting an argument in front of cameras that made the United States look like a weak bully. He gave away two of Ukraine's primary goals: regaining their territory and becoming a member of NATO. The result is a weakened hand in negotiations with Russia. And President Trump also cut off security and intelligence to Ukraine, leaving them blind and at risk of losing ground. So I made a decision to travel to Ukraine to show my support for the Ukrainian people and to bring back information, what I would learn on the ground about how these policy changes were going to impact the war. What I saw showed me just why we cannot give up on the Ukrainian people and why it's important to our security to keep Putin from winning. Of course, the Ukrainians want this war to end. They want it to end more than anybody else. But any agreement has to protect Ukraine's security, and it can't be a giveaway to Putin. This war started with what Putin thought would be a 3-day operation to take Kyiv and then control all of Ukraine. Now, we are 3 years later, and that hasn't happened. The Ukrainian people, with security and intelligence assistance from us and from our allies, have been fighting for every inch of their homeland. They've endured constant missile barrages on cities and hospitals. I visited one of these hospitals myself, and this hospital had been hit with gunfire. There were holes in the exterior walls of a hospital. There was a crater on the sidewalk in front of the door of this hospital where a mortar round landed. And there, in this hospital, I spoke to wounded soldiers who were eager for nothing more than to get back into this fight. I also met with nurses who shared their stories of this invasion through tears. They told me, this is, Mr. President, this is hard to repeat on the floor of the Senate. They told me how they witnessed Russian soldiers raping children in front of their parents, and then murdering these same children in front of their parents. Horrendous war crimes which can never be forgiven. I met with Ukrainian pilots, one of whom I had met with in Tucson when he was learning to fly the F-16. I'll be honest, when I first visited their F-16 training at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, I wasn't sure that they could step up to flying the Viper. It's not an easy airplane to fly, and I wasn't sure that they would be effective in combat. Those pilots have more than proven themselves flying challenging combat missions against the Russians, who are protected by a considerable electronic warfare defense and a surface-to-air missile defense, and by the way, are also flying some pretty sophisticated airplanes. I spoke to one pilot. This guy shot down 6 cruise missiles and drones on a single mission. And he did this while carrying only 4 air-to-air missiles. So how'd he do this? Well, 2 of the targets, he had a gun. Used the gun of the F-16 to shoot him down. That is really hard to do. My twin brother, who's also a Navy pilot, we were both stunned. That's impressive. They're stepping up. Ukraine's underdog status against the heavyweight Russia has bred a scrappy innovation that the United States should envy and that we can learn from. I heard it in their words when they said that they would fight. Get this, Mr. President. They said they would fight with rocks and sticks if they had to defend their country against Putin. And I saw it in their efforts to produce cutting-edge weapons to take the fight directly at the Russian enemy. They're building one-way attack drones at an incredible rate, especially considering that they stood up this production from nothing. And that's what's possible when hitting your production target every single day is a matter of life and death. They have an innovation cycle that's measured in days, while ours is measured in years. And we should learn from that. Because supporting Ukraine, it's not just about defending freedom. And freedom is a fundamental tenet of what makes America great. It's also critical to our national security and preventing future bigger wars. Not only would victory make Putin stronger to strike further into Europe, but if the United States abandons Ukraine, what message does that send to our friends across the globe? It tells them we are untrustworthy and unreliable. Now, as significant as that is, the bigger deal is what we would see from China. The Chinese watch everything, and they want to take Taiwan. If they view our loyalty to our partners and allies as weak, they are more likely to take Taiwan by force. If that happens, this president or any future president will have to make one of the most consequential decisions in the history of our country. My goal is to prevent that moment. My goal in the Senate is and will continue to be to keep us out of wars. And I think that is true for most combat veterans like myself. So I came back this week with the message that we need to fix this mess and get back to supporting Ukraine. Now, I'm glad that already there has been positive movement. The announcement from the American and Ukrainian negotiations in Saudi Arabia yesterday, led by Secretary Rubio and the National Security Advisor Tim Waltz, was a step forward. Once again, we are supporting Ukraine with military security assistance and with intelligence aid, and we're working towards a resolution to this war that guarantees Ukraine's security. And Ukraine accepted a proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire. Now, this is going to come down to whether Putin will accept these terms and commit to a real negotiation. So far, he has showed no indication that he's ready for peace. Putin started this war by breaking a ceasefire. He has mobilized his entire country and the help of other dictators like Kim Jong-un to try to win this war. And every day, every single day, Mr. President, his soldiers commit war crimes. Not only must he agree to the terms of this ceasefire, he has to be held to them by the United States and our allies. America is the strongest and richest country in the world. We didn't get here by being bullies like Vladimir Putin. We got there by leading from the front and bringing our allies along with us, and standing by them like they stand by us. The safety and security of all of us, our kids, our grandkids, depends on the United States continuing to keep its word, stand for democracy, and look out for Americans by being smart and strong and standing up to the bullies. That's what I will hold this president to. And I urge my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, to do the same. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Tillis. Got you. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Thank you. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Cruz, Daines, Haggerty, Hoven, Johnson, Langford, Lee, Marshall, Marino, Murkowski, Rounds, Sullivan, Tillis, Tuberville, and Wicker. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Ms. Lummis. Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Kane and Kelly. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Lujan? No. Thanks. Mr. Padilla? No. Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Kim? No. Ms. Alsobrooks? Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester? No. Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Wyden? No. Ms. Hassan? No. Mrs. Murray? No. Ms. Slotkin? No. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Schiff? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Mr. Heinrich? No. I got you. Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Ossoff? No. Ms. Cantwell? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Van Hollen? No. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Bennett? No. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Schumer? No. Mr. Rishai? Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Mullen? Aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Curtis, aye.
Yeah, let me see the calendar. I'm getting confused all
Mr. Hawley,
the time. Watch your videos.
aye.
PLTE.
Mr. King, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Justice, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 46, and the nomination is confirmed.
Thank you.
Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified by the Senate's action, of the Senate's action. The Senator from Wyoming.
I ask unanimous consent to waive the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Soderling nomination.
Is there an objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Keith Sonderling of Florida to be Deputy Secretary of Labor, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Keith Sonderling of Florida to be Deputy Secretary of Labor shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Thank you. Thank you. Sir, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Boozman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Thank you. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Thank you. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Thank you. Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Marino. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Cassidy, Kramer, Curtis, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Kennedy, Lankford, Lummis, McConnell, McCormick, Moran, Mullen, Ricketts, Risch, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Tillis, Tuberville, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Kim, King, Lujan, Murray, Ossoff, Reed, Rosen, Slotkin, Smith, Warnock, and Wyden. Mr. Peters, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Hagerty, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Husted, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. So, Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Brett, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. No. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. No.
On this vote, the ayes are 53, the nays are 45. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination. The Democratic leader.
Nomination. Department of Labor, Keith Soderling of Florida to be Deputy Secretary.
Mr. President,
the Democratic leader.
Funding the government should be a bipartisan effort, but Republicans chose a partisan path, drafting their continuing resolution without any input from congressional Democrats. Because of that, Republicans do not have the votes in the Senate to invoke cloture on the House CR. Our caucus is unified on a clean April 11th CR that will keep the government open and give Congress time to negotiate bipartisan legislation that can pass. We should vote on that. I hope our Republican colleagues will join us to avoid a shutdown on Friday. I yield the floor.
Are we in a quorum call?
No.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for the second time over the past few weeks, I've come to the Senate floor to talk about the importance of medical research funding at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Last week, during his address to Congress, President Trump unveiled a new member of the U.S. Secret Service, a 13-year-old named DJ who had always dreamed about becoming a police officer. It was a touching moment because DJ wasn't supposed to be alive today. You see, in 2018, he was diagnosed with brain cancer and given just a few months to live. But because of advances in science and medicine, because of medical researchers conducting life-saving work, because of new treatments and cures, thank goodness this young man is alive today. And he's alive because of the work of the National Institutes of Health. But that work for a lot of other desperate families is in danger because of President Trump and his unelected assistant, Elon Musk, who are carrying out a cruel campaign to cut research funding for diseases such as childhood cancer, ALS, Alzheimer's, dementia, and so many more. I don't know young DJ or his family, but I can just imagine what they went through when they told their son had brain cancer. Who can imagine as a parent what that must have been like? And I'll bet you one of their first questions to the doctor was basic. Is there a cure? Is there a treatment? Is there something we can do? Thankfully, the answer was yes, because of medical research. You know, all the miracle drugs you see on TV, constant deluge of ads about new drugs, 99% of drugs approved in the last 10 years benefited from NIH research. NIH funding is what kids like DJ are using to beat cancer, why babies are being spared preventive illness, why HIV is no longer a death sentence, why progress is being made in ALS and so many neurological diseases. But since the start of this administration, we've seen a White House unleash a lawless, chaotic attack on everything from the Federal Aviation Administration to biomedical research. First, President Trump and Elon Musk ordered a freeze on most federal grant funding, including medical research funding. You see, after extensive review of grant applications, the NIH awards approximately $38 billion a year in funding to the best and brightest medical researchers at universities in all 50 states, Illinois included. But Trump and Musk inexplicably view this as wasteful and needless. While this freeze was found illegal by a federal judge, the administration has continued to defy court order. To this day, we are taking actions to prevent medical research funding from going out to scientists and labs with breakthrough ideas. As a result, NIH has delayed awarding approximately $1 billion in grant funding to institutions nationwide. What alarms me is that NIH funding has not historically been a partisan issue. This used to be the most bipartisan thing in the Senate. Over the past decade, a bipartisan group in Congress, Roy Blunt, Republican senator from Missouri, Lamar Alexander, Republican senator from Tennessee, Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, joined with me in an effort to increase funding for NIH. This bipartisan team, which I was proud to be part of, increased NIH funding over the last 10 years by 60%. We did this because we know that sickness does not respect partisan lines. We need cures on a bipartisan basis, and NIH funding leads to new breakthroughs for all patients in need, supports good-paying jobs in red and blue states, and cements our global leadership. Illinois universities and hospitals receive approximately $1.3 billion in NIH funding every year. That supports 16,000 researchers in our state and $3.6 billion in economic activity. And our state is the rule, not the exception in this regard. But Trump and Musk aren't finished here. Next, they tried to indiscriminately slash how NIH pays for indirect cost. What's an indirect cost? It helps medical research operate the laboratories. It pays for the new computers, the microscopes, the handling of hazardous materials. They are negotiated on a case-by-case basis between the federal government and each hospital or university. Look, I'm open to discussions about reforms to show how indirect costs are calculated, but just arbitrarily and illegally slashing all indirect cost allotments will stop medical research in its track in many laboratories. Thankfully, Illinois' Attorney General, with 21 others, sued and secured a temporary relief for universities and researchers. Now, Trump and Elon Musk have focused their efforts on firing the medical researchers themselves. Reports indicate that 1,200 NIH employees have been fired so far, experienced vaccine researchers, the next generation of scientists, and the acting director of the NIH Alzheimer's and Dementia Program. Further, Trump and Musk have ended a popular trainee program that brought 1,600 young scientists out of colleges to the NIH world, the renowned campus in Maryland. NIH research leads to new cures and treatments that extend, improve, save lives. That's why I'm once again trying to pass a resolution pledging just basic bipartisan support for NIH. This resolution is simple. It says the work of NIH should not be subject to interruption, delay, or funding disruptions in violation of the law. And it reaffirms the workforce of NIH is essential to sustaining medical progress. For kids like DJ, for people like my friend Brian Wallach, who's fighting ALS, for every family out there dealing with life-threatening diagnoses, we cannot, we must not stay silent in the face of Donald Trump and Elon Musk's assault on medical research. I will never stop fighting to protect NIH and the medical research it supports. I hope that it will become, once again, a bipartisan effort. And so, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration, and the Senate now proceed to S-Res 93. Further, that the resolution be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered and made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The Democratic whip.
I'm disappointed. I hope I can appeal to my friend from Oklahoma about how important this is to every single state. It's certainly important to my state of Illinois, where we have thousands of researchers and millions of dollars being spent. But it's also important to his state. Oklahoma has some very valuable laboratories and hospitals that do research as well. I'd like to just give you some examples. Each year, Oklahoma receives $160 million in NIH funding. This money supports 2,500 jobs in the state of Oklahoma and $450 million in economic activity. The top NIH-funded research in Oklahoma is the University of Oklahoma. It receives $80 million a year. With this funding, researchers in Oklahoma have recently conducted medical research on slowing kidney disease progression, improving brain function after strokes, and how changes to cell activity can slow progression of Alzheimer's. Senator Mullen, I know, is a proud graduate, I'm sure, of Oklahoma State University, which receives $15 million in NIH funding annually. And so, Mr. President, I hope I can appeal to my colleague and others to take a close look at their own home states of how this medical research makes a difference in their states and will make a valuable difference in the quality of life for Americans across the board. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, we're 50 days into Donald Trump's second term, and the American economy is already in free fall. Prices are soaring, stocks are plummeting, and people are panicking about a recession. None of this was inevitable. All of this is Trump's own making. This week, after Trump couldn't categorically rule out that his policies would lead to a recession, NASDAQ had its worst day in years while the Dow Jones dropped a whopping 1,300 points. But it's not just the stock market that is taking a hit, it is regular people everywhere. Consumer confidence is down by 7 points. 7 points in 50 days since Trump took office, and spending has dropped for the first time in 2 years. The dollar is weaker, hiring is slowing, interest rates are unlikely to come down, and GDP is expected to shrink this quarter for the first time in 3 years. You know, usually presidents get too much blame or too much credit for the state of the economy. But not this time. Trump is going out of his way to plunge the economy into chaos and make life harder for everyone. And whether you're buying groceries or trading stocks or hoping to retire next month, you are getting hit. When the Commerce Secretary was asked yesterday about a potential recession, he said, quote, "It's worth it." It's worth it. They actually think a recession would be worth it. And if the economic numbers coming in are bad, if they show that the economy is shrinking or the costs are rising, their solution is to cook the books, to make them seem better. Because when the data is bad, change it. Everybody knows that. Instead of getting to work on lowering prices on day one like he said he would, the president has spent his days plotting the rebirth of a Gilded Age with tariffs and tax cuts. That was a time when the rich got richer while everyone else got screwed. Trump tells a different story. Quote, "We were at our richest. We were at our richest from 1870 to 1913, he said. That's when we were a tariff country. We were a very wealthy country, and we're going to be that way again," end quote. And so I just want to make clear, yes, I'm a partisan. Yes, I think Donald Trump is screwing up the economy. But it's really important for us to understand they actually do have a theory of the case, and that is the golden age from 1870 to 1913. I didn't say that. The president said that. I didn't say, hey, these